The ancient city of Ouagadougou stirred with the familiar rhythms of African twilight. As the sun painted the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple, the capital of Burkina Faso transformed from a bustling center of commerce into a tapestry of intimate communities. Street vendors called out their final bargains of the day, their voices weaving through the warm evening air like threads in a traditional kente cloth. Children laughed as they chased each other between market stalls, their bare feet kicking up small clouds of red dust that danced in the fading light. Motorcycles navigated the unpaved roads with practiced ease, their headlights beginning to pierce, the gathering dusk like fireflies emerging at nightfall. The scent of wood smoke mingled with the rich aromas of grilled meat, creating an olfactory symphony that spoke of home, family, and the simple pleasures of West African life. This was the Africa that existed beyond the headlines, vibrant, resilient, and eternally hopeful, despite decades of challenges. In the heart of the city's working-class district, nestled between a tailor shop where skilled hands crafted beautiful boo-boo and a small pharmacy that served the neighborhood's medical needs, stood Chez Fatou, a restaurant that embodied the unpretentious dignity of everyday life. The establishment would never grace the pages of international travel magazines or attract the attention of food critics from Paris or London. Its appeal lay not in luxury, but in authenticity. The restaurant's exterior was modest, weathered concrete, walls painted in cheerful yellow with hand-painted signs in French and Moore announcing the day's menu. Plastic tables and chairs occupied the small outdoor seating area, where customers could watch the street life unfold while enjoying their meals. Inside, fluorescent lights cast their practical glow over simple wooden tables adorned with colorful plastic tablecloths. The walls displayed a gallery of faded photographs, local football teams celebrating victories, politicians from various eras making campaign promises, and family portraits of customers who had become friends over the years. This was exactly the kind of place where ordinary citizens gathered after long days of honest work. Teachers who had spent their day educating the next generation, mechanics whose skilled hands kept the city's vehicles running, market vendors who had bargained and sold from sunrise to sunset, all found refuge here in the warm embrace of Mama, Fatou's hospitality. The proprietor herself moved through the dining area with the grace of someone who had spent decades perfecting the art of making strangers feel like family. Fatima Ouedraogo, known to all as Mama Fatou, wore her 60 years with dignity. Her colorful head wrap was always immaculately arranged, and her kind eyes seemed to possess an infinite capacity for understanding the struggles and joys of her customers. She had opened this restaurant 23 years ago with a loan from her women's cooperative, determined to create a space where good food and genuine community could flourish. The menu at Chez Fatou reflected the soul of Burkinabe cuisine. Perfectly prepared rice served with rich peanut sauce, tender chunks of beef or chicken seasoned with local spices, fresh vegetables grown in the region's fertile soil, and the kind of hospitality that made even the simplest meal feel like a celebration. The aroma that filled the air was not just about food, it was about culture, tradition, and the unbreakable bonds that connected people to their homeland. As evening deepened, the restaurant filled with its usual clientele. A group of university students occupied a corner table, their textbooks and notebooks scattered among empty plates as they debated political theory and economic development. Their passionate discussions about Africa's future mixed with the more practical conversations of market vendors comparing their day's sales and mechanics sharing techniques for repairing aging vehicles. Near the entrance, an elderly man named Burema sat alone, slowly savoring his meal while listening to traditional music playing softly from an old radio. His weathered hands told the story of a lifetime spent as a farmer, working land that had been in his family for generations. Despite his limited formal education, his eyes held the wisdom of someone who understood the rhythms of both the earth and human nature. A young mother named Aminata fed her two small children while chatting with her neighbor about the challenges of finding affordable school supplies. Her husband worked as a taxi driver, and together they represented the emerging middle class that was slowly but steadily improving their family's circumstances through hard work and determination. At another table, a group of teachers shared stories about their students, their faces lighting up as they discussed a particularly bright child who showed promise for university studies. Their dedication to education, despite modest salaries and challenging working conditions, embodied the hope that knowledge could transform their nation's future. This was the real Burkina Faso, not the version portrayed in foreign media reports, about poverty and instability, but a living, breathing community of people who faced challenges with dignity and confronted difficulties with collective strength. It was among these authentic representatives of his nation that Captain Ibrahim Traoré chose to spend this particular evening. In the far corner of Chefatu, at a table partially obscured by shadows, sat a young man whose presence seemed to anchor the entire restaurant's energy, though few initially recognized him. Captain Ibrahim Traoré had deliberately chosen civilian clothes for this evening. A simple white cotton shirt, dark trousers, and worn leather sandals that could have belonged to any university student or office worker. His military fatigues hung in his modest apartment, replaced by the uniform of an ordinary citizen seeking connection with the people he served. At 33, Traoré possessed the kind of quiet intensity that marked natural leaders. His face, lean and thoughtful, bore the concentration lines of someone who carried enormous responsibility with grace. When he smiled, which was often during interactions with fellow citizens, his entire demeanor transformed, revealing the warmth and humanity that had made him beloved across Africa and beyond. His eyes, dark and intelligent, seemed to absorb everything around him, constantly learning from every interaction and conversation. This evening ritual of dining among the people was not a political calculation or a photo opportunity. It was a fundamental aspect of how Traoré understood leadership. He believed that a leader disconnected from the daily realities of his people's lives was no leader at all, merely an administrator of abstract policies. The notebook beside his plate contained handwritten notes about agricultural reforms, infrastructure projects, and educational initiatives, but it also held observations about the real-world impact of government policies on families like those surrounding him in Chefatu. The bodyguards who discreetly protected him had learned to blend seamlessly into these environments. They occupied separate tables throughout the restaurant, appearing to be ordinary customers engaged in casual conversations while maintaining professional vigilance. Their leader had taught them that security meant understanding community, not creating barriers between power and people. Traoré ate slowly, savoring each bite of Mama Fatu's expertly prepared rice and sauce while occasionally jotting notes in his journal. These observations weren't about policy implementation or political strategy, they were about humanity. The way the elderly farmer at the next table carefully saved half his meal to take home to his wife. The pride in the young mother's voice as she described her daughter's academic achievements. The animated discussion among students about renewable energy solutions for rural communities. These moments reminded him why he had risked everything to lead Burkina Faso's transformation. It wasn't about personal ambition or historical legacy. It was about ensuring that people like these could live with dignity, opportunity, and hope for their children's futures. The revolution he had helped orchestrate was not about changing governments, but about changing the fundamental relationship between leaders and led, between the powerful and the people they claimed to serve. As he wrote in his notebook, Traoré reflected on the journey that had brought him to this point. From his youth in rural Burkina Faso, where he had witnessed firsthand the impact of corrupt leadership and foreign exploitation through his military training and education, to the moment when he and his colleagues had decided that enough was enough. that their generation would not accept the continued impoverishment of their homeland while its resources enriched foreign corporations and local collaborators. The path had not been easy. International pressure, internal resistance from entrenched interests, and the constant challenge of building new institutions while maintaining stability had tested every aspect of his leadership. Yet evenings like this, surrounded by citizens who were slowly seeing improvements in their daily lives, reminded him that the struggle was worthwhile. A young waiter approached his table to refill his water glass, recognizing him but maintaining the respectful discretion that Mama Fatou had taught all her staff. "Good evening, Captain," he whispered quietly. "Thank you for the scholarship program. My sister will start university next month." Traoré smiled and squeezed the young man's shoulder gently. "She earned it through her own hard work. I just made sure the opportunity existed." These interactions, multiplied across thousands of communities throughout Burkina Faso, represented the true measure of revolutionary success. Not the applause of international conferences or the approval of foreign governments, but the gratitude of a brother whose sister could now pursue higher education, the relief of farmers who were finally receiving fair prices for their crops, the hope of teachers who could now access the resources needed to educate the next generation effectively. Outside the restaurant windows, Ouagadougou continued its evening rhythm. Street vendors were packing up their stalls, students were heading home from late classes, and workers were finishing their daily routines. The city pulsed with the energy of people building something better, one day at a time, one family at a time, one dream at a time. Traoré understood that true leadership meant being present in moments like these, not just during crises or celebrations, but in the quiet evening hours when ordinary people lived their ordinary lives with extraordinary dignity. The notebook beside his plate would soon contain new insights about how policies translated into human experiences, how government programs affected real families, and how the revolution could better serve the people it claimed to represent. None of the diners could have predicted that this peaceful evening was about to become a defining moment in their nation's story. The stage was set not for a political drama or a military confrontation, but for a test of character that would reveal the true nature of authentic leadership under pressure. The restaurant's peaceful atmosphere began to shift almost imperceptibly, as three men entered Chez Fatou with the calculated precision of predators surveying new territory. Their entrance was not dramatic or attention-grabbing, but something about their presence introduced an undercurrent of tension that sensitive observers might have noticed. The first man commanded immediate, albeit reluctant, respect through his physical presence alone. Tall and lean, with the kind of bearing that suggested a lifetime of expecting deference, he wore clothes that announced his wealth without subtlety. His Italian leather shoes, impractical for Ouagadougou's dusty streets, but perfect for making a statement, clicked against the restaurant's simple concrete floor. His tailored shirt, pressed trousers, and expensive watch spoke of connections to the kind of international business deals that had, until recently, extracted enormous profits from Burkina Faso's natural resources while leaving local communities impoverished. This was Amadou Diallo, heir to a business empire built on mining concessions and import monopolies that had thrived under previous governments. His family's wealth had been constructed on the foundation of exploitative contracts with foreign corporations, arrangements that had made a few Burkinabe families enormously rich while keeping the vast majority of citizens in poverty. Traoré's reforms had systematically dismantled these corrupt systems, redirecting resource revenues toward education, healthcare, and infrastructure that benefited all citizens rather than enriching a connected elite. His first companion was everything. Diallo was not stocky, powerfully built, with hands that bore the calluses of someone who had once worked with his tools. Mamadou Ouedraogo had indeed been a skilled mechanic in his younger years, respected in his community for his ability to repair vehicles that others had given up on. His calloused hands told the story of honest labor, of fixing engines and solving problems that helped his neighbors maintain their livelihoods. But somewhere along the way, Ouedraogo had lost faith in the possibility of legitimate success. The corruption of previous governments had created a system where connections mattered more than competence, where political loyalty was rewarded more generously than technical skill. He had gradually transitioned from fixing machines to facilitating deals, from solving mechanical problems to serving as an intermediary between foreign interests and local officials who could be bought. The third member of their group provided the starkest contrast to his companions. Where Diallo exuded arrogant confidence and Ouedraogo projected aggressive determination, this man radiated nervous energy that suggested deep ambivalence about their mission. Dr. Joseph Caboret had once been idealistic, fresh from university. With degrees in economics and development studies, convinced that technical expertise and good intentions could solve his country's problems. Years of disappointment had eroded that idealism. He had watched qualified proposals rejected in favor of projects that enriched connected families. He had seen foreign aid diverted from intended purposes into private accounts. He had witnessed the gap between development rhetoric and development, reality, until cynicism had replaced hope, and desperation had made him receptive to offers from those who promised that the old system, despite its flaws, was preferable to the uncertainties of revolutionary change. The three men chose a table in the restaurant's far corner, positioning themselves with clear sight lines to the entire dining area. Their whispered conversations were punctuated by sharp glances and subtle gestures toward other patrons, creating an atmosphere of surveillance that some customers sensed without understanding. Diallo pulled out his smartphone, a latest generation device that cost more than most of the restaurant's customers earned in several months, and began scrolling through news articles and social media posts with increasing agitation. His jaw tightened as he read story after story celebrating Traoré's latest initiatives, a new agricultural cooperative that was increasing farmer incomes, a literacy program that was expanding educational opportunities in rural areas, a healthcare initiative that was reducing infant mortality rates. "Look at this propaganda," he whispered to his companions, his voice carrying contempt and frustration. "They're portraying him as some kind of savior while he destroys everything our families built over generations." His perspective was shaped by the zero-sum thinking that characterized the old elite. Any gain for ordinary citizens necessarily represented a loss for the previously privileged class. Ouedraogo leaned forward, squinting across the restaurant before nodding slowly in recognition. His mechanical background had trained him to identify problems and develop solutions, but his analysis was colored by resentment at seeing his own fortunes decline while others prospered. "There he is," he confirmed quietly, just sitting there, like any ordinary citizen, while he tears down the system that kept this country stable. Dr. Caboret shifted uncomfortably, beads of sweat forming on his forehead despite the evening's manageable temperature. His academic training had taught him to analyze complex systems and understand unintended consequences, but his emotional state was dominated by a mixture of fear and desperate hope that somehow returning to familiar corruption might restore his own sense of security and purpose. These were not random citizens expressing legitimate political disagreements. They represented the remnants of a system that had thrived on inequality and exploitation. Each had lost something tangible when Traoré's government had prioritized transparency over connections, competence over corruption, and national development over private enrichment. Diallo had seen lucrative mining contracts canceled when the new government discovered that they provided minimal benefits to local communities while generating enormous profits for foreign corporations and their Burkina Faso partners. Ouedraogo had lost income from facilitating corrupt deals when new procurement systems emphasized competitive bidding and technical qualifications. Dr. Caboret had found his consulting contracts terminated when government agencies began hiring, based on merit rather than political connections. Their grievances were real, but their proposed solution, public humiliation of a popular leader, revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of both political dynamics and human nature. They had convinced themselves that embarrassing Traoré would somehow delegitimize his government and create opportunities for their own restoration to influence and wealth. The plan they had developed was simple in its conception and catastrophic in its potential consequences. They would create a public scene, challenge the captain's authority through personal insults and accusations, and film the encounter for maximum distribution through social media platforms. Their foreign contacts had assured them that such footage would damage Traoré's reputation internationally and potentially inspire broader resistance to his reforms. What they failed to understand was that their target possessed something they had never encountered in their experience with previous leaders: authentic connection to the people he served, moral authority earned through sacrifice and service, and the kind of character that transforms challenges into opportunities to demonstrate principles under pressure. Mama Fatou, moving between tables with her characteristic grace, noticed their intense discussions but interpreted them as routine business conversations. Her restaurant frequently hosted informal meetings among traders, contractors, and professionals who used its relaxed atmosphere to discuss deals and partnerships. She had no reason to suspect that these particular customers were planning an assault on one of her other patrons. Other diners remained equally oblivious to the dangerous undercurrent developing in their midst. The university students continued their passionate debates about economic development theories. The teachers shared stories about their students, achievements, and challenges. The elderly farmer savored his meal while listening to traditional music. The young mother fed her children while planning their educational futures. The scene was set for a confrontation that would test not just individual character, but the very foundations of the relationship between leaders and citizens in the new Burkina Faso. The three conspirators exchanged final glances, steeling themselves for what they believed would be a necessary confrontation with a leader they had profoundly underestimated. Their moment was approaching, and they prepared to make their move against a force far greater than they could comprehend. Not just a military officer or a political leader, but the embodied hope of millions of people who had finally found representation that matched their dignity and aspirations. The transition from plotting to action occurred with the mechanical precision that Ouedraogo brought to all his endeavors. Rising from his chair with calculated deliberation, he signaled to his companions that their moment had arrived. Diallo straightened his expensive jacket and checked his smartphone one final time, ensuring that the recording function was ready. To capture what he expected would be Traoré's humiliation. Dr. Kabore reluctantly pushed back from their table, his academic mind already beginning to question the wisdom of their approach, even as his emotional desperation drove him forward. They began their approach through Chez Fatou's modest dining area, weaving between tables occupied by families sharing, evening conversations, and students reviewing their notes over simple dinners. Each step brought them closer to a reckoning they believed they controlled, their arrogance blinding them to the gravity of challenging a leader who commanded genuine respect rather than purchased deference. The soft clatter of dishes and gentle murmur of conversation continued around them, creating an innocent backdrop for their approaching aggression. A father helped his young daughter with her homework while waiting for their meal. Two friends debated the merits of their favorite football teams. An elderly couple shared a quiet dinner, their comfortable silence speaking of decades of partnership and mutual understanding. "Excuse me?" Diallo called out as they neared Traoré's corner table, his voice deliberately loud enough to attract attention from nearby diners. The tone carried an unmistakable note of challenge, aggressive enough to signal confrontation while maintaining plausible deniability about his intentions. Several customers looked up from their meals, sensing a change in the restaurant's peaceful atmosphere. Captain Traoré looked up from his notebook with the calm composure that had become his trademark in countless challenging situations. His dark eyes met Diallo's gaze with quiet assessment, showing neither surprise nor concern at the unexpected interruption. This was a man who had faced down military coups, international pressure, and domestic opposition with the same steady demeanor he now brought to an evening meal disrupted by hostile strangers. What happened next would be replayed countless times. On social media, analyzed by political scientists, and remembered by everyone present for the rest of their lives. As recognition dawned on the three conspirators, their carefully prepared aggression crumbled in the face of reality. Diallo's sneer faltered as he found himself staring directly into the eyes of Captain Ibrahim Traoré. Not a photograph or a television image, but the actual presence of the man who had become a symbol of African dignity and self-determination. The arrogant expression that had carried him across the restaurant dissolved as the magnitude of whom he was confronting crashed down with devastating force. Ouedraogo's jaw dropped open, his prepared insults dying in his throat as he recognized the face from countless news broadcasts, social media posts, and conversations throughout the city. This was not some distant political figure they could attack with impunity, but the beloved leader whose policies had improved the lives of millions of their fellow citizens. Dr. Kabore took an involuntary step backward, his academic training, finally overcoming his emotional desperation as he understood the catastrophic nature of their miscalculation. The color drained from his face as he realized they had just committed themselves to publicly confronting the most popular leader in Burkina Faso's modern history. The restaurant seemed to freeze in that moment of recognition, as if time itself had paused to witness their shock. Conversations at nearby tables began to quiet as other diners turned their attention toward the unfolding drama, sensing that something significant was happening but not yet understanding its full import. Mama Fatou, refilling water glasses at a nearby table, dropped her pitcher, the metallic clatter echoing through the suddenly tense atmosphere as she recognized her distinguished customer and understood that he was being confronted by hostile strangers. Her maternal instincts immediately activated, protective concern flooding her expression as she assessed the potential threat to someone she had come to respect deeply. A young student at a nearby table whispered urgently to his friend, pointing discreetly toward Traoré's table with barely contained excitement. Word began to spread through whispered conversations as recognition rippled outward from the initial witnesses. "That's Captain Traoré," someone murmured. "They're confronting our captain," another voice added with growing concern. The family, with children instinctively moved closer together, sensing that something important was happening while not yet understanding its full significance. The father placed a protective arm around his daughter, while the mother gathered their belongings, prepared to leave quickly if the situation escalated. Even the radio seemed to lower its volume, as if the very air of Ouagadougou was holding its breath. Traditional melodies continued to play, but they seemed muted by the tension that had suddenly filled the modest restaurant. The peaceful evening had transformed into a moment charged with national significance. For the three conspirators, recognition brought not triumph, but terror. Diallo's expensive clothes suddenly felt like a costume, his wealth and international connections meaningless in the presence of genuine revolutionary leadership. His hands began to tremble slightly as the weight of confronting Burkina Faso's most beloved leader settled upon him like a crushing burden. Ouedraogo's calloused hands, which had seemed so threatening moments before when he imagined intimidating an ordinary citizen, now hung uselessly at his sides. His mechanical mind, trained to solve practical problems, began calculating the impossibility of their current situation and the certainty of its disastrous conclusion. Dr. Kabore's nervous energy transformed into pure terror as he realized they had just committed political suicide. His academic understanding of public opinion and political dynamics finally overcame his emotional desperation, and he began to comprehend the magnitude of their mistake. The three men stood frozen, their carefully planned confrontation dissolving into a nightmare of their own making. Recognition had stripped away their false courage, leaving them exposed and vulnerable before a leader they had gravely underestimated and a restaurant full of citizens who were beginning to understand what was happening. Recognition changed everything. These were not anonymous troublemakers challenging an ordinary patron. These were representatives of the old corrupt system attempting to intimidate the embodiment of their nation's hopes and dreams. The peaceful evening had become a test of character that would reveal the true nature of leadership under pressure. Traoré remained seated, his posture unchanged, watching the shock ripple across his would-be attackers' faces with the quiet composure that had made him a continental icon. The notebook beside his plate contained plans for agricultural reforms that would feed thousands, educational initiatives that would expand opportunities for the next generation, and healthcare programs that would save lives. Yet these men had seen fit to interrupt his peaceful meal with aggression born of selfish grievance. The moment of recognition was complete, but the real test was just beginning. How would authentic leadership respond to direct challenge? How would a revolutionary who preached dignity and justice handle those who sought to destroy both? How would a man who claimed to serve all citizens treat those who refused to accept the new reality of shared prosperity and mutual respect? The restaurant held its breath, waiting to discover whether their captain would live up to the principles he had proclaimed or reveal himself to be just another politician whose noble words crumbled under pressure. History was about to unfold in Shefatu, and everyone present would carry this moment with them forever. In the crucial seconds that followed recognition, Captain Ibrahim Traoré made a choice that would define not only this encounter, but his entire approach to leadership. Rather than responding with anger, calling for security, or allowing the situation to escalate into confrontation, he rose slowly from his chair, with movements that seemed to expand his presence far beyond his physical form. The simple act of standing transformed the modest restaurant into a stage of historical significance. As Traoré rose to his full height, not particularly tall by conventional standards, but somehow filling the space with an authority that had nothing to do with physical dimensions, the atmosphere in Shefatu became electric with tension and anticipation. His voice, when he finally spoke, cut through the silence with a quiet power that made the restaurant walls seem to vibrate with moral authority. "Gentlemen," he said, his tone carrying the weight of a nation's hopes and dreams, "you speak of destroying our country while dining in comfort, bought by its exploitation." The words landed like precision strikes, each syllable dismantling their false sense of superiority with devastating effectiveness. Diallo's mouth opened and closed wordlessly, his prepared insults crumbling before Traoré's unwavering gaze. The expensive smartphone in his hand, ready to record what he expected would be the captain's humiliation, now felt heavy and useless. Nearby diners leaned forward, instinctively drawn to witness this masterclass in dignified strength under pressure. The university students abandoned their textbooks, recognizing that they were about to receive an education in leadership that no classroom could provide. Even the children seemed to sense that something monumental was unfolding before their innocent eyes. Traoré's response demonstrated the fundamental difference between authority based on fear and power rooted in moral legitimacy. Rather than matching aggression with aggression, he met their hostility with a calm dignity that exposed the poverty of their position more effectively than any angry retort could have achieved. "Your concern is not for Burkina Faso," he continued, his gaze moving deliberately from one conspirator to the next, "but for the profits you can no longer extract from our people's suffering." His words struck home with surgical precision, cutting through their pretenses to reveal the selfish motivations that drove their opposition to his reforms. The transformation in the restaurant was remarkable. What had begun as an attempted ambush was becoming a public demonstration of the character that had made Traoré beloved across Africa and beyond. Citizens who had been quietly enjoying their evening meals found themselves witnessing a defining moment in their nation's history. An elderly man at a corner table, who had been slowly savoring his dinner while listening to traditional music, suddenly removed his cap with trembling hands. Burema had lived through decades of corrupt leadership, foreign exploitation, and broken promises. His weathered face bore the scars of a lifetime under systems that treated ordinary citizens as expendable resources rather than human beings deserving dignity and opportunity. But now, witnessing his captain's grace under direct attack, tears formed in his eyes as pride swelled within his chest. This was leadership he had never imagined possible, strong enough to resist aggression, wise enough to respond with dignity, and secure enough to transform challenge into opportunity for moral education. Mama Fatou clasped her hands to her heart, overwhelmed by the honor of hosting this extraordinary demonstration of principled leadership in her humble establishment. She had served thousands of customers over the years, but she had never witnessed anything like this. A leader who embodied the values he proclaimed, who treated even hostile confrontation as an opportunity to demonstrate the character that justified his people's trust. The ripple effect of recognition and respect spread throughout the restaurant like wildfire. Other patrons began to stand, not in anger toward the three aggressors, but in reverence for a leader who was showing them what authentic power looked like when wielded with wisdom and restraint. A young woman studying at a nearby table closed her textbook and rose to her feet. Her grandmother's stories of colonial oppression had taught her to recognize true leadership when she saw it, and she understood that she was witnessing history in the making. Her student uniform represented the educational opportunities that Traoré's government had expanded, making higher education accessible to young people whose families had never imagined such possibilities. A taxi driver, who had been enjoying his evening meal after a long day of work, stood up, his weathered baseball cap bearing the colors of Burkina Faso. His calloused hands bore witness to honest labor in service of his family, and his posture spoke of a man ready to defend his country's hope against those who sought to destroy it. Two university students exchanged glances before rising together, their textbooks forgotten as they witnessed a real-time demonstration of the leadership principles they had been studying in theory. This was political science in action, moral philosophy made manifest, revolutionary theory transformed into lived reality. The spontaneous unity that emerged was not orchestrated or planned. It rose naturally from hearts that recognized genuine leadership and wanted to protect it from those who would drag their nation back into corruption and exploitation. A mechanic, still wearing his work clothes and bearing grease stains on his fingers as badges of honest labor, pushed back his chair and stood. His skills kept the city's vehicles running, contributing more to national strength than all the foreign investments these conspirators represented. A mother who had been feeding her children while planning their educational futures whispered words of respect in Mooré, teaching her little ones to witness dignity in action. Her children would grow up with this memory, seeing how strong people respond to aggression with grace rather than retaliation. Even the restaurant's young waiter set down his tray, choosing to stand with the man who represented his generation's aspirations for a better future. This was not about politics or ideology. It was about character, about the choice between building up or tearing down, between serving others or serving only oneself. The three aggressors found themselves surrounded, not by an angry mob seeking revenge, but by the quiet strength of united citizens who embodied the very dignity they had failed to understand. Their expensive clothes and foreign backing meant nothing in this temple of local authenticity, where honest work and genuine leadership commanded respect that could never be purchased. Diallo looked around desperately, searching for sympathy that simply didn't exist among these genuine representatives of the people. His wealth, which had always provided him with deference and influence, was revealed as hollow decoration compared to the substance of character displayed by everyone around him. Ouedraogo's earlier confidence evaporated completely as he realized. They faced not just one leader, but an entire community's resolve. His mechanical mind, trained to solve practical problems, began to understand that they had fundamentally miscalculated the nature of power in the new Burkina Faso. Dr. Traoré began backing toward the exit, his academic training finally overcoming his emotional desperation as he understood the catastrophic nature of their miscalculation. They had expected to find an isolated politician vulnerable to public humiliation. Instead, they had discovered a leader whose authority flowed from genuine service and whose strength derived from the love and respect of the people he served. The transformation was complete. In attempting to isolate and humiliate one man, the conspirators had instead awakened the collective spirit of a nation determined to defend its revolutionary hope. The restaurant had become a microcosm of Burkina Faso itself, ordinary people rallying behind a leader who represented their highest aspirations rather than their lowest fears. This was the power that the old elite could never comprehend. Authority, based on love rather than fear, strength derived from service rather than domination, leadership that elevated everyone rather than concentrating benefits among the privileged few. The evening had become a masterclass in authentic power, and everyone present was learning lessons that would last their lifetimes. What happened next would be remembered not just for its immediate impact, but for the way it demonstrated the transformative power of authentic leadership when faced with direct challenge. As the three conspirators stood frozen in their shame, surrounded by citizens who had spontaneously risen to defend their leader, Captain Ibrahim Traoré made another choice that elevated the encounter from a simple confrontation to a profound lesson in human dignity. Rather than allowing the gathered citizens to express their anger toward those who had sought to humiliate their beloved leader, rather than calling for the conspirators' arrest or using this moment to demonstrate his power over those who opposed Traoré chose a response that stunned everyone present, including his would-be attackers. "Gentlemen," he said quietly, his voice carrying compassion rather than condemnation, "you are still Burkinabe, and this restaurant serves all who enter with respect." His words fell like cool water on the heated atmosphere, transforming potential violence into an opportunity for redemption that no one had anticipated. The impact of this response was immediate and profound. Diallo, who had expected retribution, received instead the very dignity he had tried to deny his victim. His hands, which had been trembling with fear and regret, now shook with the overwhelming realization of what he had just witnessed. This was not the behavior of a typical politician or military leader. This was grace in action, strength revealed through restraint rather than retaliation. Ouedraogo stared at his own calloused hands, remembering when those hands had built homes for neighbors rather than accepting foreign money to tear down his country's hope. The mechanical precision that had brought him to this confrontation was now calculating the magnitude of character difference between himself and the man he had sought to attack. Dr. Traoré felt tears of shame beginning to form as he recognized that he was being offered the very forgiveness his actions had attempted to destroy. His academic understanding of political theory had never prepared him for this encounter with moral leadership that transcended conventional categories of power and opposition. The assembled citizens watched in amazement as their leader demonstrated mercy toward those who had shown him none. This was not weakness masquerading as strength, but strength so secure in itself that it could afford to be merciful. Even Mama Fatou, who had witnessed countless human dramas unfold in her restaurant over the years, had never seen anything like this transformation of hostility into an opportunity for moral education. "Your foreign backers will abandon you when this fails," Traoré continued with gentle firmness. "But Burkina Faso will welcome you back when you choose to serve rather than exploit." His words offered a path forward that none of them had expected. Not punishment, but the possibility of redemption through changed behavior and renewed commitment to their homeland's welfare. The restaurant's atmosphere had shifted from tension to something approaching sacred space, where justice was being administered through compassion rather than condemnation. The university students scribbled furiously in their notebooks, capturing this lesson in statecraft that no textbook could adequately convey. They were witnessing leadership that transcended mere political maneuvering to touch something deeper in human nature. The elderly farmer, Ibrahim, nodded slowly, recognizing the wisdom of a leader who understood that lasting change comes through the transformation of hearts rather than the destruction of enemies. His weathered face reflected decades of witnessing leaders who ruled through fear and intimidation, making this demonstration of principled leadership all the more remarkable. The mechanic with grease-stained fingers smiled slightly, proud to support a leader whose strength was measured not by whom he could defeat, but by whom he could redeem. This was the kind of leadership that built nations rather than merely governing them, that created lasting change through moral example rather than temporary compliance through force. The young mother, teaching her children to witness dignity in action, whispered a prayer of gratitude for this living demonstration of the values she wanted to instill in the next generation. Her children would grow up understanding that true strength protects rather than destroys, builds rather than tears down, elevates rather than diminishes. "The door remains open," Traoré said with a gesture toward the restaurant's entrance, offering the three men an exit with their dignity partially intact, rather than the public destruction their plan deserved. This simple gesture carried profound meaning. It demonstrated that even in the face of direct attack, authentic leadership seeks to preserve human dignity rather than crush opposition. The grace he was showing would ripple outward like stones thrown into still water, teaching not just those present, but eventually reaching far beyond the modest walls of Chez Fatou. This was how lasting transformation occurred, not through the defeat of enemies, but through the conversion of hearts, not through the demonstration of superior force, but through the revelation of superior character. As the three conspirators stood in the presence of this unexpected mercy, each faced a choice that would define the rest of their lives. They could continue down the path of opposition and foreign manipulation, or they could accept the offered redemption and find ways to contribute to their nation's genuine development. The restaurant had become a classroom where the deepest lessons of leadership and citizenship were being taught through lived example rather than abstract theory. Everyone present, from the university students to the elderly farmer, from Mama Fatou to the young children, was receiving an education in human dignity that would influence their actions and decisions for years to come. As word of the restaurant encounter spread beyond the walls of Chez Fatou, it ignited conversations across Burkina Faso and eventually throughout Africa and beyond. The story traveled through the interconnected networks of modern communication, social media posts, WhatsApp messages, radio broadcasts, and the ancient but still powerful medium of word-of-mouth storytelling. At the University of Ouagadougou, students gathered around smartphones and laptops in dormitory common rooms, watching grainy footage that had been captured by other diners and quickly uploaded to various platforms. The political science department, led by Professor Aminata Sankara, no relation to the legendary Thomas Sankara, but inspired by his legacy of African dignity, paused their evening seminar on leadership theory to witness this real-time demonstration of principled governance under pressure. "This is what we've been discussing in abstract terms," Professor Sankara told her students as they watched the video footage. "Leadership that derives its authority from moral legitimacy rather than institutional power, strength that reveals itself through restraint rather than aggression, wisdom that chooses transformation over retaliation." Her students took notes frantically, understanding that they were witnessing a case study that would be analyzed for generations. Text messages buzzed across the campus as young people shared their admiration for a leader who embodied the values they hoped to carry into their own careers and civic engagement. The engineering students discussed how Traoré's calm response demonstrated the kind of systematic thinking they applied to technical problems, analyzing the situation completely before choosing the most effective solution, which in this case meant de-escalation rather than confrontation. Medical students, studying late into the night, paused their review of anatomy textbooks to discuss the encounter in terms of healing. How authentic leadership could heal divisions in society just as medical intervention could heal physical ailments. They understood that what they had witnessed was a form of social medicine, treating the disease of division with the therapy of dignity and respect. In rural villages where internet connections were slower and less reliable, the story spread through traditional networks of communication that had connected West African communities for centuries. Market women shared the news as they sold vegetables and grains, adding their own commentary about the difference between leaders who served themselves and leaders who served their people. Farmers working in their fields during the early morning hours discussed the encounter as they tended to crops that were finally receiving fair prices thanks to Traoré's agricultural reforms. The story took on additional meaning in their context. They had direct experience of how authentic leadership translated into improved daily conditions, making the captain's restaurant demonstration more than symbolic gesture. Radio stations across the Sahel region picked up the story, broadcasting it to audiences who had been following Burkina Faso's transformation with keen interest. In Mali, Niger, Senegal, and Ghana, citizens heard the account and found themselves inspired by this example of African leadership that prioritized dignity over domination, service over self-interest. The story reached international audiences through various channels, sparking discussions in diplomatic circles, academic conferences, and policy institutes around the world. International relations professors found themselves using the restaurant encounter as a case study in soft power, how authentic leadership could command more respect and influence than military might or economic leverage. In Washington, London, Paris, and Beijing, analysts struggled to categorize Traoré's response within conventional frameworks of political behavior. The incident didn't fit standard patterns of how leaders typically respond to direct challenge, making it difficult for foreign governments to predict or influence Burkina Faso's future trajectory. African diaspora communities in Europe and North America shared the video footage with pride, seeing in Traoré's dignified response a reflection of the continent's highest values and capabilities. For young Africans studying abroad, the encounter provided a powerful counter-narrative to the stereotypes and limitations often projected onto African leadership. Back in Burkina Faso, the ripple effects continued to expand in unexpected directions. The three conspirators found themselves unwilling celebrities of the worst kind, their faces recognized on streets where they had previously walked with anonymity, their actions discussed in households where their names had never been mentioned before. Diallo discovered that his expensive clothes and international connections meant nothing in a social environment where moral character had become the primary measure of worth. His business associates began distancing themselves from someone who had so publicly demonstrated poor judgment and worse values. Ouedraogo found his mechanical skills in less demand as customers preferred to support businesses whose owners hadn't been involved in attacks on their beloved leader. His calloused hands, once symbols of honest work, now reminded him of the choice he had made to use those hands in service of destructive rather than constructive purposes. Dr. Kabore faced the most complex consequences, as his academic credentials created expectations for better judgment and moral leadership that made his participation in the conspiracy particularly disappointing to former colleagues and students who had respected his expertise. Yet even for these three men, the story offered possibilities for redemption that reflected Traoré's original offer of forgiveness. Some of their former associates reached out privately, suggesting ways they might contribute positively to national development if they chose to abandon foreign manipulation and embrace genuine patriotism. The restaurant itself became an unexpected pilgrimage site, with citizens wanting to sit where they had witnessed dignity triumph over aggression in the most authentically African way possible. Mama Fatu found herself hosting not just regular customers, but visitors from across the country, and eventually from other nations, all seeking to experience the atmosphere where authentic leadership had been demonstrated under pressure. Local artists began creating paintings, sculptures, and songs inspired by the encounter, transforming it into cultural touchstones that would preserve its lessons for future generations. The story entered oral tradition alongside other tales of wisdom and moral courage that African communities had preserved for centuries. Children who had been present that evening found themselves elevated to special status among their peers, as living witnesses to a moment of historical significance. Their parents used the experience as a teaching tool, helping the next generation understand the difference between leadership that serves others and authority that serves only itself. The encounter had transcended its modest setting to become a continental symbol of authentic African leadership standing firm against corruption, foreign manipulation, and moral bankruptcy. What began as an attempt to humiliate one leader had instead amplified his message to audiences across Africa and around the world. In the weeks and months following the restaurant encounter, the story of Captain Ibrahim Traoré's response to direct confrontation became more than a news item. It evolved into a teaching tool that influenced leadership development, conflict resolution, and civic education across Africa and beyond. The encounter was analyzed in university classrooms from Cairo to Cape Town, where professors of political science, international relations, and African studies used it as a case study in authentic leadership. Students examined how Traoré's response demonstrated principles that textbooks could describe but rarely illustrate so clearly. The power of moral authority over institutional force, the effectiveness of dignity in neutralizing aggression, and the way authentic leaders transform challenges into opportunities for moral education. At Makerere University in Uganda, Professor James Mugerwa incorporated the restaurant incident into his course on African governance, contrasting Traoré's response with typical patterns of authoritarian reaction to opposition. Notice, he told his students, how Captain Traoré chose to elevate rather than diminish his opponents, to educate rather than punish, to heal rather than harm. This is leadership that builds nations rather than merely governing them. The story reached beyond academic circles into practical applications. Conflict resolution organizations across the continent began incorporating elements of Traoré's approach into their training programs for community leaders, traditional authorities, and civil society activists. The emphasis on maintaining dignity for all parties, even in the face of hostility, proved remarkably effective in reducing tensions and creating space for genuine dialogue. In Ghana, the National Peace Council adapted the restaurant encounter into role-playing exercises for traditional chiefs and community elders, helping them practice responses to confrontational situations that preserved both their own authority and their opponent's humanity. The results exceeded expectations, with several long-standing community disputes being resolved through approaches inspired by Traoré's example. Religious institutions throughout West Africa incorporated the story into sermons and religious education. Programs, finding in it powerful illustrations of forgiveness, strength through restraint, and love for enemies that resonated with core spiritual teachings. Christian, Muslim, and traditional religious leaders discovered common ground in analyzing how authentic spiritual principles had been demonstrated through political leadership. The business community, initially skeptical of revolutionary rhetoric and concerned about political instability, found themselves reassessing their assumptions about leadership effectiveness. Several multinational corporations operating in Africa began incorporating elements of Traoré's dignified approach into their executive training programs, recognizing that sustainable business success required authentic relationship building, rather than mere transactional interactions. International development organizations, long frustrated by the gap between good intentions and effective implementation, began studying how Traoré's leadership style had generated genuine popular support for difficult reforms. The restaurant encounter became a symbol of how authentic leadership could mobilize community energy for positive change in ways that external pressure and financial incentives often failed to achieve. The story had particular impact among young Africans who saw in Traoré's example a new model of what continental leadership could become. Youth organizations across Africa organized discussions, debates, and creative projects inspired by the encounter, exploring how its lessons might be applied to their own communities and future careers. In Kenya, university student leaders adapted Traoré's approach during campus protests, choosing dialogue over confrontation and achieving more substantive reforms than previous generations of student activists had accomplished through more aggressive methods. Their success inspired similar approaches in other countries, creating a new pattern of youth engagement with authority figures. The encounter influenced artistic expression throughout the continent, inspiring musicians, writers, filmmakers, and visual artists to explore themes of dignity, authentic leadership, and the power of moral authority. A Senegalese filmmaker began developing a documentary about the broader impact of the restaurant encounter, tracing its influence through various African societies. Nigerian novelist Chimamanda Adichie referenced the incident in a speech about the importance of authentic African narratives, noting how a simple restaurant encounter had done more to project positive images of African leadership than decades of expensive public relations campaigns funded by governments and international organizations. The story even influenced African diplomatic approaches in international forums. Ambassador Fatou Bensouda of Senegal cited Traoré's restaurant response during a United Nations Security Council debate, arguing that African nations could contribute unique perspectives on conflict, resolution based on indigenous traditions of dignity-preserving dialogue. Continental organizations began incorporating elements of the restaurant encounter into leadership development programs. The African Union's Peace and Security Council commissioned a study of how traditional African approaches to conflict resolution, exemplified by Traoré's response, might be adapted for modern diplomatic and political challenges. The encounter had revealed something profound about African leadership potential that had been obscured by decades of corruption, foreign manipulation, and internalized colonialism. Here was evidence that the continent possessed indigenous traditions of governance that could address modern challenges while maintaining core values of human dignity and community solidarity. Perhaps most importantly, the story began influencing how ordinary Africans thought about their own leadership potential. If a young military officer could demonstrate such wisdom and restraint under direct attack, what might be possible if similar principles were applied in families, communities, businesses, and civic organizations throughout the continent? The restaurant encounter had become more than a memorable anecdote. It had evolved into a teaching story that would be passed down through generations, each retelling adding new layers of meaning and application. Like the traditional African folktales that preserved wisdom through entertaining narratives, Traoré's response to his would-be attackers had entered the continent's collective consciousness as a guide for navigating conflict with dignity and transforming opposition into opportunity for moral leadership. While the world celebrated Captain Ibrahim Traoré's demonstration of authentic leadership, the three men who had attempted to humiliate him faced a more complex and difficult journey. Their public failure had exposed not just their poor judgment, but the moral bankruptcy of the system they represented. Yet even in their shame, the seeds of potential redemption that Traoré had planted began to take root in unexpected ways. Amadou Diallo, the wealthy businessman whose expensive clothes and arrogant demeanor had led the confrontation, experienced the most dramatic fall from grace. His social circle, built around wealth and international connections rather than genuine relationships, quickly abandoned him when association became a liability rather than an asset. Business partners who had once competed for his attention now avoided his calls, and social invitations that had once filled his calendar disappeared entirely. But isolation, painful as it was, created space for reflection that had been impossible during his years of privileged comfort. Alone in his expensive but suddenly empty house, Diallo began to confront questions he had spent decades avoiding. What had his wealth actually accomplished? How many of his countrymen had benefited from his business success? What kind of legacy was he creating for his own children? The turning point came when his teenage daughter, home from her expensive boarding school in France, asked him directly about the restaurant incident she had seen discussed on social media. "Papa," she said with the brutal honesty that only children can bring to uncomfortable truths, "why did you try to attack someone who was just eating dinner? And why are my friends saying he was trying to help people while you were trying to stop him?" Unable to provide satisfactory answers to his own child, Diallo began what would become a years-long process of examining his life choices and considering how he might contribute to his country's development rather than merely extracting profits from its resources. It would not be an easy transformation, and it would require genuine humility that his privileged upbringing had never taught him to develop. Mamadou Ouedraogo's journey took a different trajectory. His background as a skilled mechanic provided him with practical perspectives that his wealthy co-conspirator lacked, but it also made his participation in the attack more personally devastating. He had betrayed not just his country's leader, but his own working-class origins and the values of honest labor that had once defined his identity. The rejection he faced from former customers and colleagues was particularly painful because it came from people who had once respected his technical abilities and trusted his integrity. Mechanics in his neighborhood began receiving the business that had previously come to his shop, and former friends crossed the street to avoid uncomfortable conversations about his choices. But Ouedraogo's mechanical background had taught him that broken systems could be repaired if the underlying problems were properly diagnosed and addressed. He began attending community meetings in his neighborhood, initially as a silent observer trying to understand how he had become so disconnected from the people whose interests he should have been defending. Gradually, he started contributing his technical skills to community projects, helping repair the local school's generator, maintaining the water pump at the neighborhood mosque, fixing bicycles for children whose families couldn't afford professional repairs. These small acts of service didn't immediately restore his reputation, but they began the slow process of rebuilding trust through demonstrated commitment to community welfare. Dr. Joseph Kabore faced perhaps the most complex consequences, as his academic credentials had created expectations for better judgment that made his participation in the conspiracy particularly disappointing to former colleagues and students. Universities where he had once been a respected lecturer found themselves fielding questions from students and parents about how someone with advanced degrees in economics and development studies could have made such poor choices. But his academic training, which had initially made his fall more dramatic, also provided him with analytical tools for understanding his mistakes and developing strategies for redemption. He began writing a detailed analysis of how educated elites could become disconnected from the people they claimed to serve, using his own experience as a case study in the dangers of intellectual arrogance and moral compromise. His paper, initially written for his own understanding, eventually found its way to development organizations and academic institutions throughout Africa. Its honest examination of how personal disappointment and foreign manipulation could corrupt even well-intentioned intellectuals provided valuable insights for others facing similar temptations. The three men's separate journeys eventually intersected in unexpected ways. Diallo, seeking to understand how his wealth might be redirected toward genuine development, reached out to Ouedraogo for advice on practical projects that could benefit working-class communities. Ouedraogo, in turn, consulted with Kabore about the theoretical frameworks that might guide effective community development initiatives. Their collaboration was initially awkward and tentative, marked by the shame they all carried from their public failure. But gradually, they began to discover that their different backgrounds and skills, business resources, technical abilities, and academic knowledge could be combined in service of the community development they had once opposed. The project they eventually developed was modest, but meaningful. A technical training center that would teach young people practical skills while providing them with the theoretical knowledge needed to become entrepreneurs rather than merely employees. Diallo provided initial funding, Ouedraogo contributed technical expertise and teaching, and Kabore developed curriculum that connected practical skills with broader understanding of economic development. Their first graduating class included the young waiter from Chez Fatou, who used his training to start a small electronics repair business that served his neighborhood's needs while providing him with sustainable income. The success of graduates like him began to rehabilitate the three men's reputations, not through publicity or political maneuvering, but through demonstrated commitment to community welfare. The irony was not lost on any of them. Their attempt to destroy Traoré's revolutionary vision had ultimately led them to embrace its core principles of service, community development, and national sovereignty. Their redemption was possible precisely because the leader they had attacked had chosen grace over punishment, creating space for transformation rather than demanding retribution. Years later, when journalists occasionally asked about the restaurant incident, all three men would acknowledge their shame while expressing gratitude for the opportunity to rebuild their lives around more meaningful purposes. Their story became another layer of the encounter's legacy, demonstrating that even those who choose wrongly can find paths toward redemption if they are willing to accept responsibility and commit to service. As the story of the restaurant encounter continued to resonate across Africa and beyond, it began to influence not just individual behavior, but institutional approaches to leadership, conflict resolution, and national development. The incident had revealed something profound about African leadership potential that challenged both domestic and international assumptions about governance on the continent. Traditional Western models of political leadership, based on adversarial systems and zero-sum competition, seemed inadequate to explain or replicate what Traoré had accomplished. His response had drawn on deeper African traditions of consensus building, restorative justice, and community healing that predated colonial impositions and had survived despite decades of suppression. At the Institute for Security Studies in Pretoria, researchers began developing new frameworks for understanding African governance that incorporated indigenous approaches to conflict resolution. Dr. Amina Hassan, a political scientist specializing in African leadership systems, published a groundbreaking paper that used the restaurant encounter as a starting point for examining how pre-colonial African societies had maintained stability through dignity-preserving dialogue rather than winner-take-all competition. What Captain Traoré demonstrated, Dr. Hassan wrote, was not an innovation, but a recovery, the restoration of African approaches to leadership that had been obscured by colonial impositions and post-independence power struggles. His response to direct challenge reflected traditional African values of Ubuntu, community harmony, and the belief that true strength reveals itself through the ability to transform enemies into allies. The analysis resonated with scholars and practitioners across the continent who had long argued that sustainable African development required governance systems rooted in indigenous values rather than imported models that often failed to account for local social dynamics and cultural priorities. Regional organizations began incorporating elements of Traoré's approach into their own operations. The Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS, adapted his emphasis on dignity-preserving dialogue for their mediation efforts in regional conflicts. Instead of simply imposing solutions through economic pressure or military intervention, they began focusing on creating spaces where all parties could maintain their honor while finding common ground. The African Union's Continental Early Warning System began training its conflict prevention specialists in approaches inspired by the restaurant encounter. Rather than waiting for crises to explode into violence, they learned to identify and address tensions while maintaining respect for all stakeholders' fundamental dignity and legitimate interests. International development organizations, initially skeptical of approaches that seemed to prioritize relationships over efficiency, began to recognize the practical effectiveness of Traoré's methods. Projects that incorporated dignity-preserving dialogue and community ownership achieved higher success rates and greater sustainability than traditional top-down implementations, even when they required more time for initial consensus building. Thut. World Bank's Africa region commissioned a study of how indigenous African governance principles might be integrated into development project design. The research revealed that communities where traditional consensus-building processes were respected and incorporated showed significantly better outcomes in areas ranging from education and healthcare to infrastructure development and environmental conservation. Business leaders across Africa began adapting Traoré's approach to corporate governance and labor relations. Instead of adversarial negotiations between management and workers, companies began experimenting with dialogue processes that maintained dignity for all stakeholders while addressing legitimate concerns about productivity, compensation, and working conditions. In South Africa, mining companies that had been struggling with labor disputes for decades began using principles derived from the restaurant encounter to restructure their relationships with workers and communities. The results exceeded expectations, with several operations achieving their highest productivity levels in years while simultaneously improving worker satisfaction and community relations. The success of these applications attracted attention from multinational corporations operating throughout Africa, leading to the development of Ubuntu management principles that were eventually exported to operations on other continents. What had begun as an African approach to dignified leadership began influencing corporate culture in Europe, Asia, and the Americas. Educational institutions across Africa began incorporating the restaurant encounter into their curricula, not just as a political science case study, but as an example of applied ethics, conflict resolution, and cultural preservation. Students learned to analyze the incident from multiple perspectives: psychological, sociological, economic, and spiritual, developing more comprehensive understanding of leadership challenges and opportunities. The University of Ghana's School of Public Administration developed an entire course around the encounter, examining how Traoré's response demonstrated integration of traditional African wisdom with modern governance challenges. Students engaged in role-playing exercises that helped them practice dignity-preserving approaches to difficult conversations and confrontational situations. Religious institutions throughout Africa found in the encounter powerful illustrations of spiritual principles that transcended denominational boundaries. Christian churches explored connections between Traoré's forgiveness of his attackers and biblical teachings about loving one's enemies. Islamic scholars examined how his response reflected Quranic principles of justice tempered by mercy. Traditional religious leaders saw connections to indigenous African concepts of spiritual leadership that prioritizes community healing over personal vindication. The encounter's influence extended beyond formal institutions to informal networks of communication and cultural transmission. Market women across West Africa incorporated the story into their daily conversations, using it to teach children about proper responses to conflict and the importance of maintaining dignity even when facing hostility. Griots, traditional West African storytellers and historians, began incorporating the restaurant encounter into their repertoires, ensuring that its lessons would be preserved and transmitted through oral tradition alongside other tales of wisdom and moral courage that had guided African communities for centuries. The story entered popular culture through music, literature, and visual arts. Malian musician Amadou and Mariam composed a song about the encounter that became popular across Francophone Africa, while Nigerian novelist Teju Cole wrote a short story that used the incident as inspiration for exploring themes of authentic power and moral authority. Perhaps most significantly, the encounter began influencing how ordinary Africans thought about their own potential for leadership and positive social change. Community organizations throughout the continent reported increased participation in local governance, civic education, and development initiatives as citizens became more confident that dignified, principled approaches could achieve meaningful results. The restaurant encounter had revealed something that many had forgotten. Africa possessed indigenous traditions of governance and conflict resolution that were not only compatible with modern challenges, but often more effective than imported alternatives. Traoré's response had demonstrated that authentic African leadership could command international respect while remaining rooted in continental values and priorities. 5 years after the evening that transformed a modest restaurant in Ouagadougou into a symbol of authentic African leadership, the impact of Captain Ibrahim Traoré's response to confrontation continued to ripple through communities, institutions, and individual lives across the continent and beyond. Chez Fatou had indeed become a pilgrimage site, but not in the way that transforms local establishments into tourist attractions. Instead, it remained authentically itself, a place where ordinary people gathered to share meals and conversations, while occasionally remembering that they were sitting where extraordinary character had been demonstrated under pressure. Mama Fatou, now recognized as one of Burkina Faso's most respected small business owners, had used the restaurant's increased visibility to mentor other women entrepreneurs throughout the region. Her establishment had become a training ground where women learned not just culinary skills, but business management, customer service, and the kind of leadership that builds communities rather than merely serving customers. The 3 men who had attempted to humiliate Traoré had indeed found paths toward redemption, though their journeys had required years of genuine service to their communities. Their technical training center had expanded to serve 3 provinces, providing practical education to hundreds of young people who might otherwise have struggled to find meaningful employment. Amadou Diallo, once known primarily for his wealth and international connections, was now recognized for his innovative approaches to sustainable development financing. His business acumen, redirected toward community benefit rather than personal enrichment, had helped establish cooperative enterprises that kept resource revenues within local communities while generating employment for skilled workers. Mamadou Ouedraogo had become a respected voice in technical education policy, using his practical experience to ensure that vocational training programs actually prepared students for real-world employment rather than merely fulfilling bureaucratic requirements. His workshops had become models for similar initiatives throughout West Africa. Dr. Joseph Kabore's academic analysis of elite disconnection from popular needs had evolved into a comprehensive framework for preventing the kind of moral corruption that had nearly destroyed his own career. His work was now used in universities across Africa to help educate the next generation of leaders about the temptations and responsibilities that accompany privilege and education. The encounter had influenced leadership development far beyond Burkina Faso's borders. Training programs for government officials, business executives, and civil society leaders throughout Africa now incorporated principles derived from Traoré's response: the power of dignified restraint, the effectiveness of moral authority, and the importance of creating space for opponents' redemption rather than their destruction. International relations had been subtly but significantly influenced by the restaurant encounter's demonstration of how strength could be revealed through restraint rather than aggression. Several regional conflicts that might have escalated into violence had been resolved through dialogue processes inspired by Traoré's approach, saving thousands of lives and millions of dollars in reconstruction costs. The story had entered global consciousness as well, studied in leadership programs at universities from Harvard to Oxford, analyzed in diplomatic training institutes, and referenced in corporate boardrooms where executives sought to understand how authentic authority could be more effective than hierarchical control. But perhaps the most significant impact was the one that would be hardest to measure: the changed understanding of leadership potential that had taken root in the minds and hearts of ordinary Africans who had witnessed or heard about the encounter. Children who had been present that evening were now young adults, carrying with them the memory of how strong people respond to aggression, with dignity rather than retaliation, with education rather than punishment, with transformation rather than destruction. The young waiter from Chez Fatou, now a successful entrepreneur with his own electronics repair business, regularly spoke to students about how witnessing authentic leadership had influenced his own approach to customer service, employee relations, and community engagement. His business had become known not just for technical competence, but for the respectful way it treated customers and the mentorship it provided to young people seeking practical skills. University students who had been studying political science during the restaurant encounter were now professors themselves, incorporating its lessons into their own teaching and research. They had helped establish a new field of African leadership studies that emphasized indigenous approaches to governance and conflict resolution. The encounter had proven that authentic leadership was not about perfect responses to ideal conditions, but about maintaining character under pressure, choosing transformation over retaliation, and demonstrating through personal example the values that make societies worth defending and improving. As Captain Ibrahim Traoré continued to lead Burkina Faso through the challenges of development and modernization, he carried with him the knowledge that leadership was not a position to be defended, but a service to be performed, not a privilege to be enjoyed, but a responsibility to be fulfilled with integrity and humility. The restaurant in Ouagadougou, where it all began, continued serving meals to ordinary people living extraordinary lives, carrying forward the dreams and struggles of a continent determined to write its own story of dignity, development, and hope. The tables where citizens had spontaneously stood to defend their leader now hosted new conversations about the future, where young people planned careers in service to their communities and elders shared wisdom about the patient work of building better societies. And sometimes, in the evening light that filtered through modest windows, those present could almost sense the continuing presence of that transformative moment when grace had triumphed over hostility, when dignity had disarmed aggression, and when authentic leadership had demonstrated its power to heal rather than harm, to build rather than destroy, to unite rather than divide. The revolution continued, one conversation at a time, one act of service at a time, one choice for dignity over destruction at a time. This was how lasting change occurred, not through the dramatic gestures that captured headlines, but through the patient accumulation of character demonstrated under pressure, of principles maintained despite temptation, of leadership that served rather than ruled. The story would be told for generations, passed down through families and communities as a reminder of what was possible when leaders chose to embody the values they proclaimed, when citizens chose to support character over convenience, and when ordinary moments became opportunities for extraordinary demonstrations of human dignity and moral courage. In the end, the restaurant encounter had revealed a truth that transcended politics, culture, and geography. Authentic power flows not from the ability to dominate others, but from the capacity to elevate them. True strength is revealed not through conquest, but through the choice to heal rather than harm. And lasting leadership emerges not from the imposition of will, but from the demonstration of character that inspires others to become their best selves. This was the legacy of one evening in Ouagadougou when a young captain chose grace over retaliation and transformed 3 would-be attackers into symbols of redemption. A modest restaurant into a temple of dignity, and a simple meal into a masterclass in authentic leadership that would influence hearts and minds for generations to come.